The world of business has changed, so we've changed everything with software-defined interconnection, reduced complexity, improved performance, greater flexibility, lower connectivity costs. All with a simple-to-use platform that makes this feel like this. Is effortless and fast, predictable and secure. It's self-provisioning, automated, spin-up connections and flex bandwidth on demand, and only pay for what you use. All this within a global community that shares, collaborates, and grows together. Take control, cut complexity, make interconnecting effortless with Console Connect.
Aloha, this is Mahi Eleni with PTC. Thank you for attending today's session in PTC's webinar series, Frictionless Business, sponsored by PCCW Global. We now turn the time over to Joe Weinman of Xforma.
Thank you so much, Mahi Eleni. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Weinman, and I have a distinguished panel of global thought leaders here to help address this critically important topic today, namely what to do about digital. So without further ado, let me start by going around and introducing everyone or having them introduce themselves. Brad, I'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Brad Power. I'm a process innovation consultant of many years and currently focusing on helping people with a complex cancer diagnosis to help them make decisions through hackathons.
Great. Rick?
Thanks. So I started out in Accenture and then went to Microsoft. Then in 1999, I created a SaaS CRM solution inside of an existing public company, then went on to create some models that are now known as capability-based business architecture, which are a complement to the process work that Brad did, patented that, generated a Harvard Business Review article and a book called Rethink. And then since then, I've led several customer experience related digital transformations, including the Disney MagicBand and Starbucks mobile order and pay. And then I've also done some internal facing digital transformations, including Microsoft and others.
I think I've heard of those companies. Excellent. Roger?
Hi, good evening all. I'm the Global Director of Research for CIO Net, which is Europe's largest CIO community, 10,000 CIO members. Just completing my 50th year in IT, and that started actually when I was a pioneer of today's internet whilst I was studying at MIT. I was an ARPA research fellow and contributed to the IP protocols.
Well, you also had the advantage of starting your 50-year career when you were minus 10 years old. So that's definitely given you the upper hand. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is basically start off with actually many thoughts, but in a short amount of time around digital strategy and digital transformation. And then we're going to open it up to these panelists to help exploit or leverage their experience and insights. So without further ado, so unfortunately, we're not in Waikiki. Hopefully we'll rectify that at some point. So without further ado, I want to talk about what traditionally has been a topic or strategies for achieving competitive success. I won't go through them all in order, but preferential access to resources. If you own the only diamond mine or lithium mine in the world, then that's obviously advantageous for your competitive strategy. And the question is, of course, do digital technologies offer any advantage? Now, there's a famous book called Does IT Matter by Nick Carr that's now 20 years old, but his argument in a nutshell is the answer is no. And what he argues is that IT is ubiquitous and a commodity, and you can't achieve strategic advantage through anything that is a ubiquitous commodity. You achieve competitive advantage through scarcity. Of course, that makes no sense whatsoever. And we can think of lots of examples like Blockbuster, for those of you old enough to remember them, versus Netflix, or Borders versus Amazon, or we can look at Google, which has surprisingly perhaps retained a massive amount of market share in the search industry, even though it didn't have any of those advantages that I mentioned early on, such as first mover advantage or a known brand at the time. So what clearly is the case is that, sure, IT can be boring. Think about room reservation systems. It can be core to operations, but not strategically differentiating. And of course, we have those capabilities that are strategic, and in the cases of Borders or Blockbuster, are existential, or their lack turned out to cause their demise. And then we have those that can achieve societal benefits. And so that Moses model, MOSES, says that we can deploy our IT investments pretty much anywhere we want to. Hopefully, it's to help achieve strategic advantage. Now, when we think about strategy models for business, there are a lot of them. Most people are familiar with disruptive innovation from Clayton Christensen or Porter's Five Forces model. The problem with Christensen's model is it doesn't really make all that much sense. He wrote that Uber was not disruptive, that Netflix was not disruptive, and Blockbuster was right to ignore them, and that the Apple iPhone 1 actually made no difference. Now, he has a specific definition of low-end and new market disruption, which we won't get into here, but obviously there's a little bit of an issue if you're told to ignore Netflix or Apple. So a much better model, which I know Brad has a lot of expertise in, is the value disciplines model from Tracy and Viersma. And what they basically said is that you can achieve competitive advantage by focusing either on processes, resources, and organization, or on products, or on customer relationships. So I updated that in my book, Digital Disciplines, and without going into a lot of depth on it, the point is that there are 4 generic strategies that are relevant to actually leveraging digital to achieve competitive advantage. The first one basically says use digital to achieve a number of things in terms of improved processes and resource use. Originally, we can think about something like the Toyota production system, which was an information technology. It used strips of paper called Kanbans. But we can think about things like automated knitting machines to make sneakers, or the use of IT to optimize routing, and literally tens of thousands of other applications. For product leadership, we can think about what's happening with products becoming smart, digital, and connected. And if a good example of product leadership might be a high-end watch, now we have not just high-end watches or high-end restaurants, but of course, smart digital connected watches and cars and cities and roadside infrastructure and soccer balls and things like that, that can create incredible customer value, as well as new business models like pay-as-you-drive insurance or power-by-the-hour jet engines, thanks to IoT and predictive analytics based on massive amounts of IoT data collected from the engine. The third major strategy is moving from customer intimacy to collective intimacy. And the idea there is to move up the value chain from anonymous transactions to ongoing relationships to the customer intimacy model, which says not just that you understand customer needs, but that you transform your business to meet those needs, to collective intimacy, which is virtual and algorithmic. So if customer intimacy is represented by a tailor or a physician, then collective intimacy might be represented by something like the Netflix recommenders or Amazon for upsell, cross-sell. And so what this leads to is, rather than simply having a hazy view of the customer based on demographics, we can use lots of IoT-based information or sentiment analysis from social media or things like that to really understand the customer in depth. The fourth generic digital strategy is the evolution of traditional innovation to accelerated innovation. And the idea there is we move from the traditional corporate research labs to open innovation. A good example of that is Pfizer working with BioNTech to develop the COVID vaccine. But we're actually moving beyond open innovation to accelerated innovation through digitally enabled crowdsourcing. And there's lots of good examples of that, things like the Netflix Prize, the Gold Corp Challenge, GE has run Flight Quest, and so forth. And we also have idea markets and innovation networks and so forth. So ultimately where we're headed is to machine innovation. A good example of that is Google DeepMind's AlphaGo that innovated a completely new move. And we have now Melvin doing quantum physics experiments. We have other softwares doing things like automated hypothesis generation and so forth. So strategy is great, but what we want to do is actually implement not just a strategy, but we have to actually transform what we already have. And a good example is what Uber did. I know you all know about Uber or Didi, but it's instructive to look at how they achieved transformation. So if the original taxi cab model involved holding your hand up, getting the cab to arrive and them driving you around, telling you how much you owed, handing over your credit card, the new model says create an ongoing relationship, move recurring operations into that relationship, and then change the order of operations or use mobile technology to create an entire new customer journey. And then, by the way, also add in lots of new features. And so that's a great example of creating a new business through journey reengineering and leveraging digital technologies. On the other hand, we have a recent lease that I had to lease end turn in. I won't mention the manufacturer, Mercedes-Benz, but I expected my experience to be a very simple one. They already had automated payment details for me. You know, I figured I'd return the car, I'd sign something, and then they charge me something or other. Instead, my process looked like this. There isn't even room to show all the arrows, but it was so painful that I will never, ever, ever buy anything or lease anything from that dealership, and probably not that brand. And so what this says is that what we need to worry about is the entire customer journey, not just internal processes. We've got to focus on customer requirements and not just touch points or processes, but all the things they do with other stakeholders, like with competitors. And we can influence things to some extent, and we can go omni-channel or multi-channel or do O2O to basically move from separate brands run in separate units to a single integrated, digitally enabled, customer-focused, value-generating process. And so with that, I will end the slideshow and start the dialogue. So the first question that I have for everyone, and feel free to jump in, is agree or disagree. And whether you agree or disagree, what is your pithiest insight about digital strategy based on the literally the score of decades of experience that the three of you have? Since I started with you, Brad, to do intros, let's go in reverse alphabetical order. I'll start with Roger.
Thank you very much, Joe. And all of that sounds great. And you've focused on all those digital natives who've changed the game entirely. But I have to ask myself and everyone else, what's happening to the incumbents, the big S&P, FTSE, and other incumbents? Well, they're moving very slowly. In 20 years, they've virtually created no increase in equity value, certainly in FTSE, but also S&P. All the values come from the new digital natives. They have incrementally improved through mobile apps, agile development, cloud platforms, data analytics, but it's all been incremental. None of it has really fundamentally changed the operating model, the business model. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about digital transformation with regard to the big incumbents, the Procter & Gamble's, the British Petroleums, and all those other great and wonderful companies that have lasted 100 years. But one has to ask oneself, can they really grasp digital transformation at a macro level rather than using it?
And is the root cause of that a Christensen disruption theory type of, you can't disrupt yourselves unless you're Andy Grove and Intel?
I think a part of it, of course, stems from the scale at which they operate, the massive legacy in process, in people and skills, in systems and applications. It's moving mountains. It's really difficult. And again, if you talk to a major bank and say, why don't you re-platform, reinvent your core systems? They'll say, it took us 30 years to get here from start, and we haven't got the capital to actually re-platform. And that, by the way, came from the chief operating officer of Barclays Bank. So
Right.
these guys are stuck.
Rick, what's your comment? Because Disney has certainly done a lot in terms of sort of riding its original success, but also reinventing itself to some extent through Disney Plus and MagicBands and things like that. So do you agree with Roger or disagree?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of what Roger said is absolutely spot on. I happen to have worked with some of the non-digital natives who have been very successful in doing digital transformations and transformations. And so they probably are the exception today. But given that it has happened with some non-digital natives, I think there's some lessons to be learned from them. And a couple of them are, well, I'll start with are, Disney started out the MagicBand project with a very clear and simple business objective, which was to extend the average guest stay from 3 days to 4.5 days. They did not start by talking about a digital transformation. They said, this is our business goal. How are we going to accomplish it? The bracelet, the MagicBand, and the phased array antenna radios installed all over Disney World, they were not the original objective. They turned out to be delivered ultimately. And along the way, what Disney learned in 2 failures along the way was using internal people who had no experience with innovation or digital transformation, didn't have the muscle, the experience to do the work that was necessary. So Disney realized they needed to hire people who had done things like this before. Once they realized that innovation and technology were crucial to the success of the MagicBand, they got to external resources who were able to work unencumbered by the internal processes of the organization. We were able to move very fast, and we got the work done on time and on budget. So that was a really interesting project that was transformational for Disney, and it remains one of the most successful IoT projects, I believe, in history. It's a $1 billion investment that paid for itself in less than 6 months.
Wow, that's incredible, especially given that some people would say that 80% of ICT projects fail to deliver on time and on budget. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
Brad, what are your pithy insights around the viability of digital strategy, especially in light of Roger's remarks? You're on mute.
Roger and I are kind of bonded at the hip. We had a retreat at my place here in Maine for a week where I think I moved him off of the rah-rah digital transformation as possible and made him the skeptic that he's become. Because I followed the story that I followed was General Electric. And if you'll recall, G Digital was a big thing. So here you have a big industrial conglomerate, and I bought the stock, but I literally thought that they had the formula. They had leadership, all the ingredients were there. They had the leadership commitment. They had, they set up a separate edge organization, if you recall, in California. They said, we're going to be the Microsoft, Amazon, Google of this industrial innovation. And it all kind of fell apart. It just didn't stick because it ran into, and we can break it down, whether it was shareholders that weren't prepared to get Amazon kind of returns, whether it was an installed base of engineers who like to stay within the yellow lines of what they knew as a way to work, whether it was the unwillingness of leadership to change. We can decompose what happened, but it was a cautionary tale for me. There's a lot to do a postmortem on that story of GE, and that's really what soured me on the notion that, I mean, if we talk digital strategy, that's fine. You can do that for a startup, for any company, but a digital transformation says that they're going from what are, for these large incumbents, a franchise that has served them well, operating models. It's holistic, it's multidimensional, and they've been performing successfully for decades. And they reward and incent people that are going to follow in those lines. Like, you're going to get a nice watch when you have 30 years of service. You're not going to get 20-somethings hotshot graduates from the top universities saying, "Oh, it's the coolest thing possible to work at choose your large incumbent." So they you much rather work with digital exciting companies than you would with staid established companies. So I could go on, but that's my pithy, not so pithy, take on the challenges.
Well, let me just delve in a little bit on that. So there are a number of dimensions, obviously, to what digital strategy and digital transformation can mean, per my introductory remarks. And one thought that comes to mind is something that a lot of the network service providers that are probably listening to this have engaged in, which is things like better ordering systems, better billing systems. In the case of one telecom that I won't mention, they had the objective to go from something like 82 or 83 billing systems to a unified billing system. So that was pretty successful. At the end of that, instead of having 82 systems, they had the original 82 systems plus the unified billing system. So goal almost met. But companies have been successful, right, in accomplishing various things in terms of either leveraging third-party SaaS providers or streamlining their systems or going mobile and so forth, as the remarks have said. So that's kind of one aspect to it. Then there is the creation of smart digital connected products. And I guess to my mind, GE has actually done some of that, and maybe some of the other companies that we're thinking of. I mean, if you take Disney, you can look at something like FastPass as kind of an operational improvement, or maybe better systems for ordering tickets for a Disney cruise. But then you can also look at digital products and services like Disney Plus. And in GE's case, they had the Railway Movement Planner, which I think is now just called Movement Planner, which was software that helped optimize railway system movements, which are complex interconnected networks, as well as locomotive engine optimizers that would kind of augment the human conductor to reduce fuel consumption. So if we divide things into those two, would you say that GE has been successful in one dimension but not the other, or are you saying that basically it's going to be really challenging for them, has been and will be moving forward because of skills and leadership, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think you're making the right distinction between disruptive innovation as defined by Clayton Christensen. I think he had another term, you probably know, it was something like, but it was essentially saying incremental, continuous innovation.
Yeah, sustaining versus disruptive.
Sustaining, that's right. So it's same business model, same customer set, same value proposition, but we just do it faster, cheaper, better. So to the extent that it's that, they're already geared to do that. They reward that. So I would call it incremental continuous improvement, 5% year over year. Their operating model and engine and culture and incentives are all geared to do that. So they will do that. They can do that. The incumbents, the large incumbents can do that. What is difficult to do is when you violate one of those things, when you say, we're going to change the value proposition, we're going to change the operating model, we're going to change the customer set. So, the classic Clayton Christensen story was when you had, let's say, high fidelity vacuum tube based radios, and then there's this transistor radio, and they look at it and say, that's a joke. And then it gets better and better and better. That, could the incumbents, anyways, the Clayton Christensen argument, can the incumbents do that? Not so much, not too often. They don't disrupt themselves. And so that kind of disruptive change. So if we're talking about a digital transformation where transformation is written big, where it's that kind of completely new market where you kind of wipe out your existing market. They're just not set up or incented to do that.
Yeah, well, I think the term digital transformation is a ambiguous one to begin with, right? Because I think many companies will say, well, we moved this application to the cloud, hence we've successfully undergone digital transformation. Other people really mean, entirely new markets, new business models, a blue ocean strategy kind of approach. So all that said, let me ask a different question, which is, if you take Amazon as an example, Amazon.com was very successful in launching an entirely new, highly disruptive business in a new market, namely AWS. And you could also say that with smart speakers, where they own the lion's share of the market, last time I looked, they also managed to create an entirely new product category that no one even knew what it was. And so it was what Christensen would call new market disruption. But I'm not going to pick on any other of the FANG companies, but they have a reputation for being incredibly innovative and using these amazing tactics and strategies like 20% off time and funding 10x improvements and things like that. And yet, if you look at them, they don't really have that great a history of innovation. There are many things where they created something and pulled out of the market, or they're viewed as highly innovative for merely copying something that, many others already had in the market and tweaking a little bit, putting, say, the reply button at the bottom of the screen instead of the top of the screen, or coming out with a wristwatch in rose gold. So those are sort of the classic sustaining innovations. So I guess my question for you is, before we unfairly perhaps lambast the incumbent, dinosaur/giants, how much of this is just simple survivorship bias? And there are lots of startups that had all the digital skills that were necessary, and a couple of them got lucky. They were in the right place at the right time with the right thing, and really haven't been able to reproduce that, regardless of all the fanfare they may have.
And I just perhaps talk about Microsoft, because I think in many ways Microsoft is an incumbent. I mean, it's an old company compared to Amazon or Google, and yet it's reinvented itself. So I think that we don't want to be too hard on the incumbents. I mean, some of them have genuinely reinvented, and I think
that's exactly what I was going to say, Roger. Sorry to interrupt, but it was, what's the real distinction? Maybe tech companies versus, let's say physical companies, software companies versus physical companies. Any tech company, and Rick had a career at Microsoft. You can speak to this. If you miss a turn, you can become irrelevant and die. So Wang called 5 turns in the market, and people don't even probably remember what Wang was, but they called 5 turns in the market and missed the 6th, and they were out of business. And if Facebook misses the move to mobile, they're out of business. And if Google misses that turn, then they're out of business. So there's this sort of, I think you were referring to Andy Grove, but it's the only the paranoid survive. So people in tech are paranoid. They know that we can be out of business in 5 years, whereas that auto company you were pointing to before, it would take them 60, 80 years to die. General Motors has been dying for 60 years. So big established incumbents with a franchise, the pain of change is going to be greater than the risk during my tenure that the world will come to an end. My company will die.
Yeah, this
Not
is
Tesla's a good example of this.
what a threat Amazon was until it was too late.
I'm sorry, say it again, Rick. There's a little crosstalk.
The Barnes and Noble didn't understand or appreciate how much danger they were in until it was too late when Amazon came on.
Well, a lot of these companies that, formerly had such an excellent brand and deep resources, thousands of stores on every street corner and so forth, they kind of realized a little too late. Like Blockbuster did create an online ordering portal, and started playing around with fees and so forth. So, but by then it was too late, and they didn't anticipate the next turn, which which Netflix did around the move from DVDs by mail to streaming. So it's interesting. So I guess maybe since all of you work with the leading companies of the world that are trying to do this stuff, what is your maybe worst horror story of companies that you've worked for? And maybe it might be optimal to not necessarily mention them by name, but maybe perhaps by industry, and just relate what you think they were thinking. Because, again, the classic, not to focus too much on Clayton Christensen, but, he does point out that incumbents often make the wrong decisions, not because they're bad managers, but because they're good managers, right? And so they do the right thing as far as, preserving existing revenue streams and going after the higher margin customers. So, without necessarily picking on any individual or company, what have you seen? And just jump in with kind of where you were like, I can't believe they're doing this, but here's why they did this and why, and didn't turn out that great.
I have my favorite story that replaced GE is now Roche in pharmaceuticals, and it's in the area I'm working in cancer, where the trend is towards personalization. And they made 2 investments. And Roche has a great way of doing these things where they make partial investments so that they don't really use their corporate culture and overwhelm the company that they're acquiring. But they bought Flatiron Health, and they bought Foundation Medicine, each for about $2 billion. They initially had small stakes. They learned about them. They saw precision medicine was coming. It's a digital issue, right? So we need specific data about patients to give them specific treatments. And in cancer care, that's a big deal, and it has to do with genetics. So Foundation Medicine provides the genetic database that allows targeting of treatments. And Flatiron Health has an electronic medical record system where they spend most of their time, it's cancer focused, but they spend most of their time cleaning up the data, because the data in most of these systems is not suitable for scale analysis. So Roche is my poster child for making those investments, being clear about that digital was coming, and they're a few years ahead of the other pharmaceutical companies.
So that's a good story.
That's a good story.
Okay, all right.
Let me give you a horror story. I think COVID has really exposed the incumbents. I mean, you can see so many disastrous stories in the last 12 months, one of which, of course, is our own National Health Service. It scored, in some respects, high levels of vaccination. Just look at the test and trace application that it launched, a complete meltdown of no value to anyone whatsoever. And they spent tens of billions on this because they just weren't ready to operate at speed. They didn't understand what speed meant. They didn't understand really how to harness private partnerships to better effect. They were essentially rabbits in the headlights, and it will be certainly the subject of a general inquiry in months to come as to why they got these things so horribly wrong. I only hope that other countries were more successful in their endeavors on test and trace, but clearly this is a pivotal tool in the fight against COVID.
And do you have a sense of, what went wrong? Was it that they didn't use lean startup techniques to develop a minimum viable product and get feedback, or, politics, which seems to surround COVID like no other disease, has ever done, or lack of skills or budget, or what happened?
Certainly wasn't lack of budget. They managed to spend tens of billions. I think they certainly said, we'll do it all in-house because we can control it. They just didn't have the techniques, the skills, the capabilities to operate at speed. That was absolutely clear. They just were dead in the water. I mean, I just compared that today to a case in Germany where the federal bank, KfW, was told by the Ministry of Economic Affairs we have to spend 150 billion euro in the next month to save the German economy. And they developed an app in 12 days. And they handled 60,000 loan applications within the first month. It can be done, even by a government-owned department. So I'm not saying that all governments are dead in the water, but clearly, as you say, there's politics, there's not invented here. The opportunity to have gone with a progressive partner was obviously there, but was not taken. There were so many mistakes. It would need a general inquiry to really uncover the extent of the disaster.
So Roger, I'll just say this, given that they spend tens of billions of dollars for an application that didn't work, I know you have a lot of contacts, all over the world, but especially in the UK. I will offer for only $5 billion to build something that doesn't work, if that would be helpful.
I'm sure they'll take you up on it.
Okay, sounds good. I'll give you my my routing details. Rick, yes. What's your story, either best or worst or both?
Well, I'm going to build on what Roger said, and again, the importance of having skill and having done digital transformation before, and understanding what innovation is, and what Roger said, you have to have a sense of urgency and agility that a lot of established organizations, non-digital natives, just don't have that sort of velocity mentality to move fast, listen to the customer, make adjustments, and keep going. And so, as I said, what the Disney experience was that they tried with their own employees and failed, and they tried with what I'd call a big four consulting firm, and they tried and failed. And looking back, I'm like, of course they failed. Their job is to go in and deploy CRM and ERP solutions. They're not doing digital transformation innovation. They're the wrong people to hire. And they finally got to us, and we were successful. But even in that case, and in others, we had several discussions, and they said, oh, we know our customer, they wouldn't want that. Or, there's no way that this would ever be successful. And we said, well, that's purely anecdotal. You don't have any data to suggest that. And in every case, once we finally started collecting data on the customer preferences and experiences, as well as customer or employee experiences, the data told us a very different story. And it turned out they didn't know their customer as well as they thought they did, but it was a blinder for them because they were so confident that they knew how their customer would behave or how the employees would react. It prevented them from seeing what was really the opportunity and acting on it. So, yeah. So I'll stop there for now. Actually, one more point. Echoing also something you said, Joe, talking about customer journeys. Journey composition is absolutely critical, and I've seen organizations really under deliver on them and not appreciate both at the employee and customer level, where looking at what's a net new capability versus an existing capability that is being transformed, and where you're changing your process, what's going to be the impact, what's the risk. It really helps to do a full-on decomposition and understand that, and understand here's what we know and we don't know as you go into it, so that as things emerge and say, oh, well, we were wrong about that, or we were right about that. A lot of companies don't go as far down the path of journey decomposition or heat mapping as well to understand where the potential risks and problems are.
Can you describe what heat mapping is?
Sure. So when you decompose an experience, and so I'll say, a new capability at Disney that was created was to reserve experiences before you arrived at the park, like an attraction ride or even attending a parade. And so that one would be, from a heat mapping perspective, all of the capabilities there were new. Whereas in the case of going to an attraction, you already have guests going through the line and entering the attraction. So it was not a net new capability. So we would break down all of the journey steps into capabilities to say, okay, what part of the journey is going to be different, and where is it bad today, or where is the opportunity for improvement? And is this new digital transformation going to improve that particular capability? And so all of the steps involved in getting onto attraction is the overall experience. So those would be the children of the overall attraction experience. Which of those children are likely to flip if they're nested and you color them red, yellow, and green? Be clear about which one is going to cause, from a causality perspective and performance, the larger experience set to improve, and be able to have a discussion about that.
It's the highly sensitive moment of truth that can impact the entire journey.
Yeah.
Understanding where those are.
Yeah,
Okay.
and in the case of Starbucks, when we did mobile order and pay, there was a lot of concern that if people can submit all these mobile orders at certain times of the day, the people behind the counter are already at peak capacity. They can't take more orders for coffee. And so how do we solve this to not destroy the employee experience and still have a delightful customer experience? And so the solution ended up being very elegant and simple, which sort of resembled the open table experience, where you limit the number of mobile orders you can take at a given slot so you don't subdue the people behind the counter. But you have to have those kinds of conversations and say, what are the 10 steps that a person goes from either the point of sale to the espresso pole to handing off the beverage or food item? Which of those things will or won't be different as a result of this particular transformation? Printing off of labels instead of writing Joe Weinman on the cup, as an example, is a simple step that saves some time. So,
great point, Rick. So let me ask the three of you something. Suppose that a CEO says, hey, I saw this great PTC webinar. Where do you recommend that I start? What do I do first? How do I think about this?
Where do you start? And I think over the last 6 months, I've actually been able to talk to 50 top CIOs in Europe about just this subject. How do you mobilize the board, the organization, to undertake significant change, significant transformation? And every person has said it's all about the culture. It's not about the technology. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, well-known saying, but you've got to be able to shift mindset. And you can't do that overnight. It takes time. It takes incremental steps. It takes success narratives. And again, I mentioned this bank in Germany, KfW. The lady who took over as chief operating officer said, I had to pilot agile schemes. I had to pilot cloud schemes. I had to pilot many change schemes just to convey the benefits to the rest of the organization before we really started to scale out. You can't do this overnight. You are going to encounter a lot of cultural resistance until you prove your point. You have to be very practical, very focused, and essentially demonstrate the value. When people see it, they begin to believe it. So that was my own experience here.
I think that's 100% right.
Rick, you're nodding your head.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would go ahead. I was just going to say I would add two things to that. So building on that, if culture is the problem and culture is slow to change, what do you do? So I think, and Roger, you and I have talked about this before, right? One is edge versus core. So you set up things in an incubator, accelerator, separate subsidiary, whatever, and you allow them to follow the kinds of operating processes that they need. So you can hire maybe at a different pay scale. You can hire faster or slower. You can use different technology that would be hard to get through the corporate standards, what have you.
Yep. So
the edge approach, where you set things up where they're sheltered from the corporate standards, at least for a period of time, and make them as independent as possible, is one. And then the other thing I think would be scale. And that is, if you make an acquisition that's of a digital native, like a digital switched on, they can change your culture because they're at enough scale that they will merge with, if not overwhelm, your culture. So again, focusing on my case study of Roche that did this successfully, the companies they acquired, they left at arm's length, they left them independent, they even allowed them to serve their competitors, right? So they allowed them to maintain their culture, and these were scale acquisitions, so that the corporate center wouldn't overwhelm with their culture, the culture of the companies that had been acquired.
Yeah. So a couple of examples from that. Building on the edge versus core. In one company, we were put on the edge, and we weren't even allowed to talk to the employees of the company. And so we did not have any visibility into their corporate standards from technology standards perspective, process standards, nothing. So we got literally locked in a building and had 18 months to do what we had to do, hit all of their deadlines, delivered delightful customer experience success. And then once it was all delivered, they worked to integrate us and the work that we had done with the internal core people. And the way they did it was a disaster. And because we didn't know what their standards were, so we didn't follow them. And it ended up creating an enormous amount of tension and problems. So I think while I agree that the development on the edge was the right approach in that particular company, the integration effort was flawed, and it could have been done. It should have started earlier, and it would have been much less disruptive and painful once the successful solution was integrated into the core. But it was pretty rough for a little while. The other example, we were approached after the Disney project by an organization in the National Football League that I won't name, and they said, "Oh, we want you to do what you did for Disney." And a lot of companies called us with that basic message. And we said, well, their goal was to increase their guest stay from 3 days to 4.5 days. So that wouldn't make any sense for an NFL team. That wouldn't be a goal. What's the goal of what you're saying is a digital transformation? And so we ultimately got there with that particular team, but because they hadn't started with a business goal and they just said, oh, let's do the same thing you did, we had to back it up and slow it down a little bit so that they could express, where the opportunity was. And then we did another heat map in that case to say, where are the deficiencies in the NFL experience from a customer standpoint, and where would digital help that? And so we solved that and had a successful deployment. And so those are two particular examples that I think the restating that the importance of starting with a business goal is critical. And then also the notion of edge and core you mentioned, Brad, I think is right. I just think you have to be careful about how you do it, because there are ways for that to fail along the path.
Totally. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Because you want to keep it independent, but then what are the assets of the corporate parent that you're, like, why aren't they just doing that as a startup? So you're kind of in a catch-22. And then if it does scale and if it is successful, how do you reintegrate it? And that can be tragically mismanaged as well.
Yep.
Particularly in the IT community, tend to promote technology. Technology is the answer, so what was the question? And there really has been a lot of hype around new technologies. And Joe, you mentioned some, the 5Gs, the 3D printing, the AI, big data, all of those good things, and they're all fine. But the real question, I think, today is, tell me what the business problem is, what you're trying to achieve at the business level, and does technology help to provide a solution for that? And again, talking to CIOs, they become much more heavily integrated into the C-suite. They really do see themselves now as peers of the C-suite. They're there to inform, they're there to talk about technology possibilities, but essentially they're there to listen to the challenges of the business. And I think that's been a sea change, actually, in the whole IT community. Even 2 or 3 years ago, IT people were still pushing technology hard.
Speaking of the needs of the business, Roger, let me ask everyone, do companies need to just focus on customers, or are there other stakeholders that are critical?
So a lot of my digital transformation work has been with customer experience, but I was involved with one with Microsoft where their goal, in addition to looking at customer experience transformations, they wanted to make sure that some of their internal employees, particularly people in the accounts receivable, accounts payable kinds of departments, would stay as employees and be happy and feel like they had a career path. And so not really as much on the innovation side of things, but the transformation that they underwent was to say, look, we've got all these old third-party software products that these people are using, not very interesting set of skills, not things they're proud of, not on a very interesting career path. So they said, everything is digital now. We need to get rid of all these old apps and give our employees in those departments tools that can not only help them be more efficient and have best practices, but also be really proud of the digital skills that they can develop and potentially even transfer to other parts of Microsoft as they've developed these digital skills. And it was a very big success. And I give them a lot of credit for thinking about those employees in that way, to focusing on employee retention as a business goal.
Could I just back that one up? I think that COVID has actually accelerated digital transformation. And in particular, hybrid working has been a major transformation across even the biggest incumbents. When, for example, Unilever had to send home over 100,000 staff in 5 days across the world, it changed the whole game. And I don't think we'll ever return back to the traditional ways of working pre-COVID. So fortunately, most organizations were at a stage where they could support home working. They've learned today to enhance a hybrid environment, to work in a hybrid environment effectively. I think a lot of employees find a much higher level of satisfaction in a hybrid environment. So I think in those terms, and I think the employee is a very key stakeholder, COVID's actually delivered something positive.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time, so let me ask each of you to summarize your insights with one super pithy remark. Brad, I'll start with you.
I'll try to be pithy. Sorry, Joe. I wanted to make a point about looking at this from a historical perspective. We've all been looking at digital transformation for decades, actually. Digital transformation didn't start in the last decade. It started probably 40, 50 years ago when Roger was pioneering the internet. And so you look back and you say, okay, what did we learn? Well, there was, and I look at it from the perspective of process improvement. So it's not about the technology, it's about the way you change processes. And what did we learn? We had total quality, and then we had Six Sigma, and I was involved with business reengineering, which was radical transformation of work based on the use of technology. And then there was lean, and then there was agile, there's moves to cloud, there's all these things. And so what lessons have we learned? What are the generalized principles that have been gathered over years? And one of them is organizations don't like to innovate continuously. They're very rare. Toyota does that. So I studied Toyota in detail, and the lean methodology, worked with the Lean Enterprise Institute to codify, because organizations want to have that Toyota performance. So they say, okay, I want to be like Toyota. Today, people want to be like Feng. So they want to be like Amazon, they want to be like Google, they want to be like Facebook. And so I've looked at those, and what are lessons there? How can you be organized culturally to continuously innovate, to be a serial innovator? What are the characteristics you would want to have in your organization if you were a CEO to say, we are embracing of change? And some of those things come from the world of software. Again, Rick knows this really well. But it's things like having small teams, small self-managed teams that are in a services architecture. So they have autonomy to control and manage the things in their purview. And they have sort of an API model that says, within this box, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to optimize that. And everybody else only needs to know that you send inputs and you get outputs, right? And it works. So those kind of things, and continuous testing, continuous integration, the notion that people build the systems, they don't do the work. So if you get people out of doing the work, people are really hard to change, but software is really easy to change. And so the extent that you can take processes and strip the people out and automate them, and then put all the people in managing the system around the process, which they've done with like Google has thousands of engineers building the continuous testing and integration systems, but they don't have people that are doing integration and testing. So the extent that you can automate the core work and put it in the people in the building and improving that system, that's another thing. So anyway, there are some lessons learned as the world moves from physical to digital, and that digital transformation, that aspect of it, that are different processes than you use in the physical world that are common to the way that people like a software company like a Google would look at the way we run and manage people. And I would submit to you that that's what Elon Musk has brought to Tesla and SpaceX as well. he's brought that software mentality and he's brought it to what's fundamentally a physical business, whether it's making cars or making rockets.
Echoing a little bit of what Roger said earlier about the fact that change there can be internal resistance and to change and lack of buy-in. So I spent a lot of time in the last 2 years in the commercial aviation space, leading digital transformation that turns out to be very complicated. In a nutshell, commercial pilots today do not get real-time wind, weather, and conflict data from a traffic perspective beyond, say, 150 miles in front of the aircraft. They do not get what's called strategic data, which surprises a lot of people. And so getting that to the aircraft and presenting it to the pilots is surprisingly complicated. But without having to explain all of that and why that's not the case, it turns out what we found is say, we're just, most people are familiar with the driving application called Waze. We're just putting Waze in the aircraft. And it's just such a simple way for people to go, oh, I know Waze. I use it all the time. I get the value. So if you're doing that for our pilots, I'm in. So it's a very simple, Brad talked about, I want to be like Fang. Well, we want to be like Waze in the cockpit. And it became a really effective tool, both for selling it to companies, but also, when we talk to the finance people about how we're going to bill them for it, it was like, oh, this is just Waze in the aircraft, in the cockpit. Like, oh, okay. And then you take what could be a half-an-hour conversation about getting wind, weather, special use airspace, turbulence into the pilot and presenting it with traffic. And we could do it a half hour, but just saying it's just like Waze, which isn't perfect, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm going to say, God bless the disruptors. Just look at what Tesla's done to the automotive industry. It may not win, but it's caused massive restructuring around the electric car. Look at what Netflix has done in the media industry. And I think that Disney has reacted very strongly with Disney Plus to Netflix. Look at fintech. Many of the fintech companies are now fundamentally challenging the whole banking system. So I think that it's the disruptors that have really taken those incumbents out of their comfort zone. And I think many of those incumbents will survive. They will get their act together, but they would not have done it in a natural way. There was no incentive for them to take the risk, to make the big moves. They would incrementally improve, as Brad has said. They would streamline their processes and automate the finance function. But they actually really didn't care about the customer. And I think that Amazon actually set a whole new paradigm in terms of customer service, customer experience. And that's really filtered through many different sectors. So, as I say, God bless the disruptors. They're doing all of us as customers a great service.
Well, thank you all so much for those great insights, especially because there's only a few days left of summer. So appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you all very much.